Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Centre video podcast. Today our guest is Gabe Collins. He's a fellow in Energy and Environmental Regulatory Affairs at the Centre for Energy Studies at the Rice University's Bakers Institute for Public Policy. Welcome, Gabe.
Thank you, Sergej. It's great to be with you. And I'll just give a very quick disclaimer that what I'm going to say today are my views only and not those of the Baker Institute. But that being said, it's great to be with you.
Thank you so much that you found time. Indeed, we will talk to you today in your private capacities, but with all your knowledge and insights which you have gathered through your extensive traveling worldwide and with your research. And one of your last papers you have published was about China hoarding energy raw materials, oil and coal. First question is it normal for countries to hoard such raw materials? And if yes, what does it mean?
Certainly, and that's literally the trillion-dollar question. So when we see what China's doing across the energy complex, coal, they have ample domestic reserves. And so the metric we watch there is not so much stockpiles per se, it's the domestic mining capacity and production capacity, which has expanded quite significantly. That is that particular dimension, and I'll address coal, oil, and gas sequentially here. For coal, that's really something that's driven by concerns about energy security and energy stability, because the same way that natural gas underpins power production in the United States and parts of Europe, or the way that nuclear does in Ukraine, for instance, coal is the baseload resource in China. Now, when we turn to oil, the questions start to acquire a sharper strategic edge, because we're now in a position where China still uses roughly 25% less oil than the United States, but it has oil stockpiles that are about 30%, at least in capacity terms, about 30% larger than ours. And we run our system, with the exception of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, on a strictly commercial basis. China, it's different, because your big oil companies that control most of that storage are parastatal entities that ultimately report to the Chinese state and are effectively under the control of the Communist Party. And so when we watch them build up stocks, there's certainly a market-driven aspect. We see them tend to store more oil when prices are low, but the inventories generally do not move as significantly in response to price as we would expect, for instance, from an American or European company, whether it's a producer, whether it's a trader that manages its inventories on more firmly commercial grounds. And so that raises part of the question. The other thing that raises part of the question about the intent with the oil stockpiling is the oil stockpiling is not occurring in isolation. It's occurring alongside the biggest peacetime military buildup that we've seen in 100 years.
This stockpiling of oil, coal, gas, normally many countries do this. I'm sorry for playing these devil's advocates role here in our conversation, that I really need to understand. We in Germany, we have the gas storages, which we even sold to Gazprom back then, and Gazprom didn't care about filling them. And then they were empty before the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine. But now they are back in the hands of German state. So we have this gas storage. We buy gas during the summer months when the consumption is low, and during the winter months we have more gas than normally, so we can use it for the cold months. Is it unnatural to stockpile energy? Because of course China is a growing economy. They need something for some sort of price spikes or other moments when they need more energy than normally.
And that's a great question. And so devil's advocate is completely fine. You can imagine the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other, and we have the basis for a good conversation. The stock holding some degree of inventories is absolutely normal, including holding them for security reasons. I mean, the United States itself does that with its Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Our partners via the International Energy Agency, some of our allies in Europe, Japan, South Korea, and so forth, hold strategic reserves. Taiwan holds strategic reserves. It's very standard. I think it's not so much the act of holding strategic stockpiles. You're using the way to think about it's a two-pronged metric to assess them is one, what is the trend in the amount of reserves you're holding, and how does that correlate with events that are going on around you? And then you're also looking, depending on the various types of reserves, are they being managed the way you would expect a strategic stockpile to? Are they being managed along more normal commercial principles, or is it something in between? What makes China something, China's effectively in the something in between category. And I think part of the reason this attracts extra attention now is most folks in the energy world that are familiar with Gazprom and the way it ran things before the war is we always had a saying, and I would sometimes get a little bit of flack for it, where I said, I agree with you that Gazprom is a commercial company, but only for 99% of the time. And the other 1% of time can pose some major strategic problems. I think when we look at the big parastatal entities in China, which again are ultimately answerable to the Communist Party, it does raise a broadly similar set of questions about intent as to what you would apply pre-February 2022 if you were looking at Gazprom or Rosneft or a company like that, that again is primarily a commercial actor, but is subject to state influence in a way that, for instance, our companies here in the United States are not.
If I understand your idea correctly, you argue that this behavior we are observing now in China is pretty similar to behavior which other dictatorships or autocracies demonstrated before, like decades ago, as they prepared for a war. Like you mentioned that the Nazi Germany in 1930s stockpiled a lot of coal and other resources, and we know how it ended. So this now it looks similar for you.
There's an uncomfortable, I mean, it sort of brings you back to the thing where history doesn't perfectly repeat itself, but it can strongly rhyme and echo. And so, yeah, the echoes are loud enough here that it definitely raises concerns because, again, what you saw with Germany in the 1930s, basically from the time Hitler took power until really intense open warfare broke out in 1939, was just a steady ramp up in energy production, which for them was coal. And this in part was to drive the war mobilization effort as well as to in their efforts to promote broader economic growth across Germany. But it was something where you broke from the trend lines in an unusual way because this was a time that the world was still in the throes of a depression. And if you look at the United States, for instance, during that same time, the U.S. produced on average about twice as much coal per year as Germany did, but there was a lot more volatility and it tended to track what you would expect the fundamental path that market-based activities would follow. Germany really broke from that, and there's some ways that we see Chinese energy stockpiling behavior breaking a little bit from market norms right now, which is a cause for concern.
Indeed, that can be a reason to believe that we are facing some challenges in the nearest future when one of the most aspiring autocracies in the world stockpiling energy, and maybe they prepare for something what we don't like to happen. But before we go further into details, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel. And if you know a person who you think needs to watch this interview and to listen to the expertise of Gabe Collins, who is a fellow in energy and environmental regulatory affairs at the Center for Energy Studies at the Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, then just copy a link and send this interview to this person. Gabe, this stockpiling, I can imagine, like, how can I stockpile food at my apartment? We all experienced that during the COVID time when people bought like some canned meat or maybe rice or other products. In Germany, people bought a lot of toilet paper that was practically Germans' national sport back then. But how do states do it? You need to have like storage facilities. You cannot just say, okay, I buy like several thousand barrels of oil and put them on some open platform. You need to build real storage facilities. How does it look like, and for how long can this facility store oil or gas or coal?
Absolutely, and that's a great question. So, coal is the easiest to store. There's a couple of ways to do it. One, if you want to just do it in the simplest form, is you literally find a big flat area of ground that's a solid surface underneath, and you can just literally bulldoze up a pile. Now, the way that you tend to see power plant operators in China and other places actually want to do it is you'll see, if you look at a satellite image, these big dome structures, and they're enormous. Sometimes they're almost 150 meters in diameter. You'll store it under that dome so that it's protected from the weather, but it's logistically fairly simple. It's a big pile of rock. Rats and mice don't like to eat it. It doesn't rot. And as long as you keep it dry, it's useful, and it'll stay useful for a very long time. Oil is a little bit different. You'll also have there's two ways you can do it. Either you can have big above ground storage tanks. And again, some of these are enormous. They're more than 100 meters in diameter and maybe 20 or 30 meters tall. You'll see those. If you look at a Google Earth image around a refinery, whether it's in China, the US, or elsewhere, you'll see they look like big white circles on the ground, and you see where the roofs float and can go up and down with the oil level. That's how they traditionally stored their reserves, and that's still how the bulk of their crude oil inventory is stored. What's interesting is in recent years, we've started to see more construction of underground cavern facilities. And these are large. You imagine basically tunneling into the side of a mountain. You're creating a bunch of cylindrical tunnels next to each other where in some cases you can store 40 or 50 million barrels of oil. And to your question about how long you can store this oil, if you rotate your stocks appropriately, you can store it for years. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve is one example of that. So it's a very long duration asset.
For this like construction, like you need practically to invest a lot of money in creating such facilities. So that means that out of point of view of a Chinese government of CCP, they profit of having that facility in several years will be higher than the costs they invest now into construction of the facility.
Sure. And so especially with the underground facilities, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. And I'll start, to be fair to the Chinese firms building them. One is land space on the surface is scarce in a lot of parts of coastal China now, and surface real estate's very valuable. And so building underground can make a lot of economic sense. The other thing that happens when you're building these big underground mined rock caverns is your initial capital cost to build the facilities can be higher per unit of storage, but your operational costs tend to be lower over time. And this is something that we don't just see happen in China. We've seen Singapore build such facilities. South Korea stores an enormous volume of its strategic reserves in underground caverns. Japan does so, and India has actually started to do so as well. And in the United States, we use solution mined salt caverns because we have somewhat different geology, but it's some of the same advantages you get from an underground facility. The other advantage of an underground facility is if you're worried about security risks, they're far more resilient. If you're under 50 or 100 meters of hard rock, you're basically immune to almost every air-delivered munition on the planet, including even those that the United States possesses. And I do think one thing that the war on Ukraine has highlighted is when you see the energy war back and forth with Russian forces striking energy assets in Ukraine and then Ukrainian forces starting to strike back at Russian oil storage and refining facilities with drones, is you realize that these surface-based facilities are incredibly vulnerable. And I think that amplifies the case for going underground if you're concerned at all about security.
Who builds all these facilities? You need special equipment and special skills for that.
You do. And so, in a statement that might not surprise you much, there's a lot of capacity in China for making and employing machinery for boring through rock and blasting and digging and, basically the combination of equipment and human skill sets that you need to do these types of things. There's a handful of heavy construction oriented societies in the world, and China's right at the top of that list. And so they seem to be pretty good at doing these things quickly and within a cost range that they can live with.
What about other goods? Like we are talking now about things which you can burn to produce energy, coal, gas, and oil. But if we look at the traditional preparation of nations for a war or a conflict, we know that like some governments can come to an idea to stockpile food, medical supply, or maybe gold. Do we observe anything like that?
Exactly. So actually, yeah, I'll sort of start down that list. So for a number of years now, we've seen China holding the largest grain inventories in the world. Don't hold me to a precise percentage, but roughly speaking, they hold, I think it's 55 or 56% now of global staple grain inventories, at least as far as the U.S. Department of Agriculture is able to track them. Basically, what I mean by staple grains is rice, wheat, corn, and soybeans. And, to kind of put that in perspective, their share of global storage is almost twice their share of global consumption. So it's definitely an outlier. Now, grains are a little bit different than the energy commodities. What we don't know is what the quality is of that storage, because when you think of things that are hard to store, for most of humanity's existence, grain has been one of the toughest things to store. I mean, part of the reason we have domesticated cats with us is when our ancestors 10,000 years ago started farming, so they quickly found they needed something to eat mice so the mice wouldn't go ruin their stockpiled grain. And that problem still endures to this day, the sort of the mold, mice, and rats. And we don't know to what extent those things might have affected these Chinese stocks and what the quality is. And, I'm not sure of an easy way to figure that out. But it's, I guess, maybe one thing that's noteworthy. I had a conversation recently with someone who pointed out that they've seen a lot more grain buying by Chinese entities. And part of me wonders if that's actually to rotate out some of their stocks and replace things that may have spoiled or, been contaminated in some way with fresher grain. That's just speculation. I don't know, but it's definitely an area that merits watching. As far as some of the other things you mentioned, those aren't so much national level indicators we would look at when you're thinking about medical supplies, blood, the same kinds of things we monitored when Russia was building up forces on Ukraine's border. And one of the things that signaled to a lot of us in the U.S. the Russians were ready to roll is when they started moving up blood and medical supplies, because you don't do that for a normal military exercise. That's something we'd probably watch on a more regional basis. You'd look at, you have to arbitrarily set what the distance is around Taiwan, but if you're anywhere within several hundred kilometers of some of those ports of embarkation that they might use if they were to engage in military operations against Taiwan, those are the areas I would watch for some of the types of changes you referred to and some of those leading indicators.
So when we talk about these resources with Chinese stockpiling, for how long, from your perspective, does it allow China to act, let me say, on a certain level of autonomy?
That's the answer to that question is that it's very dynamic, in the sense that if you're a consumer of oil, if you implement rationing and other measures to emphasize supplies to your military, that can really extend the length of time that those inventories last. Also, the inventories themselves would not just sit unreplenished. even if seaborne commerce were substantially reduced into China, they still have the option of procuring oil over land. You could expand pipeline systems from Russia. You could expand supplies even potentially from Kazakhstan. And some of the basic numbers that I've run in the past when I did a study on what an oil blockade of China might look like, we published it in Naval War College Review back in 2018. There are scenarios where they could maintain a war fighting level of oil supplies basically for many, many years. And so it's something with a very, very long timetable attached to it if they take a certain set of steps to ration how they use supplies, to procure additional supplies from some of their neighbors, and also to potentially expand production of liquid fuels made from coal and other steps like that domestically.
So do we observe some vulnerabilities in this system? You have said that the facilities are being located more and more underground, being protected from airstrikes. But to fill these facilities, you need to have pipelines. You need to have also oil refineries, which would refine this oil and produce gasoline and other types of fuel. How protected are these assets?
Definitely, and there are tremendous vulnerabilities. I mean, again, you just look at a satellite image and you see the oil tanks, you see the refining facilities, you see that there's a finite number of oil wharves that are able to berth the large tankers that they bring the imported oil in on. There's a couple of questions that arise there. One is, how concerned is somebody about if there were a conflict? If you start striking targets on the Chinese mainland, that induces enormous escalatory pressures. And I think, at least thinking about this from a more narrow American perspective, is as China's own long-range strike capabilities improve, whether it's some of these hypersonic weapons we've seen them test, whether it's a submarine carrying cruise missiles that sneaks into the Gulf of Mexico or other waters somewhere near us, or a cyber attack or something like that for that matter, we have significant reciprocal vulnerabilities here as well, which is something that, like, for instance, I'm certainly acutely conscious of when I do this analysis, because I'm down near the Houston Ship Channel and kind of that corridor from Baton Rouge down to Corpus Christi, which is one of the world's largest, if not the world's largest, collection of refinery and petrochemical assets. And so it's something where we don't live maybe in a purely glass house on this issue, but our side walls definitely have some brittleness if rocks are thrown at them. So we have to be very thoughtful if somebody was ever to contemplate throwing rocks at someone else's home, that, our home might be vulnerable as well.
And as you are located in Texas, we know that Texas has a very unique situation with energy power grid and being cut of other power grids in the United States. It's very
Exactly.
vulnerable to all problems with electricity supply, and we have experienced it recently on many levels in Texas. And the United States is not famous for having centralized systems in any level of life.
Well, exactly. So the power grid is a fascinating subject. Every time we talk to our Ukrainian friends, it's these fascinating conversations where it's a very different set of factors. And thank God we're not having somebody bombing and shelling us. But we do have a reasonably acute understanding here of what it's like to be without electricity, either when it's really cold, because during our winter 2021 blackout, our temperatures here in Houston were similar to what the temperature would be in Kyiv during February. And it's not very fun to be out of electricity. Or like after the hurricane just last week, we're out of power and it's 94, 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a pretty unpleasant situation too, and even dangerous if you have elderly people with you or young children or somebody who has health problems. And so, yeah, the power grid issue is a huge strategic one. And, it's something that you normally don't fix quickly, but it's definitely something, at least, on our side of the Atlantic here, we're paying an increasing amount of attention to for a whole number of reasons.
can we in the West outbalance these preparations by China? I don't talk about that China is immediately preparing for a war, but even if China will try to influence the price on the global market, it can lead to unpleasant situations in the US. I just imagine price spike in front of the presidential elections can have negative consequences for everyone. Can the West outplay China here, creating similar stockpiling facilities and preparing itself for shortages on the global market?
Yeah, so that's also an excellent question. So I think the first thing there is there's such a fundamental difference in systems. Like their system, when you have these big parastatal companies that are controlling the storage, the domestic production of oil, most of the import and trading activities, it's easier to set up these kinds of architectures. We don't have a similar, our system is basically the polar opposite in many ways. But the other advantage we have that they don't is we're an absolute energy powerhouse in terms of our production here. We're, depending on what month you look at, the biggest global oil producer as well as the largest consumer, which makes it complex. We're by a huge margin the world's biggest natural gas producer. And if somebody ever wanted to go back down coal road, is we have some of the world's biggest coal reserves as well. And so we have almost an embarrassment of riches. I think what we've struggled with in the last decade or so in the United States is we don't always have the political will to create the conditions to properly utilize those resources. And one of the things that we have really, and certainly I personally have started to hammer on, is the US needs to think very hard about promoting an energy abundance agenda, that we don't win the competition with China by becoming China, but we also don't win it by restricting basic commodity trade. What I always remind people is even during the deepest, darkest parts of the Cold War, you think of some of the 1970s, for instance, 1980s, the United States sold huge amounts of grain to the Soviet Union, and we still won the strategic competition because we had a system that was more efficient, it was more productive, and for a whole host of reasons, it was more attractive to people around the world. And I think that really should be our core organizing principle as we go into this competition with China and also with Russia and Iran and North Korea and the states that are aligned with China, is that there are certain goods we should restrict, high-end semiconductors, for instance, and some of the AI algorithms and other technologies. It's a combination of restriction and also, frankly, we want to induce top scientists globally to come here to the United States. These are things we need to think about when we contemplate our immigration policy and so forth. Is over and over in our history, recruiting talented immigrants from abroad has yielded these outsized dividends for us and helped us win various competitions. We shouldn't forget that. And then again, at the end of the day, when we're thinking about energy, we should be more source agnostic. We do want to pursue things cleanly, but we need to do it in a way where we're not just picking through political diktat one source or another. We want an open competition. We want abundance. And, that's the way that we ultimately win this competition, whether it's with China or anyone else.
But when we talk about energy, we may not forget about the routes of transporting oil and gas and coal. And if for gas, in most cases, you need pipelines, except of the cases when it's LNG transport, which can be done by naval vessels. But for oil, for example, the world is totally dependent on sea routes, on tankers. The same as with coal. Coal can be transported also. Many coal routes are railroads practically, but still you have also a lot of coal transportation from Australia, let me say, or from South Africa on sea route. And what we are observing now, that one of the most important sea routes through the Red Sea is being practically blocked or endangered by the Houthi rebels, who are once again aligned with China. So is it here something which you can say that China is trying also to impact the global trade routes for energy resources once again pulling the balance of this competition in own favor.
You're raising an excellent point about the Houthi situation in the Red Sea. My own view, based on whatever evidence I've been able to see at this point, is the Chinese are, in this case, committing the sin of omission, as in they're not doing anything, as opposed to the sin of commission, which is arming and inspiring and supporting the Houthis. I think in the Houthi case, the sin of commission is clearly being committed by Iran. I think China, it's more of a sin of omission, in that just like the United States in any other trading nation, they benefit from free and open navigation of the world's seas. And yet one is they corrode the norms around this, both with their actions in their own environment. For instance, militarizing the South China Sea, harassing foreign vessels, all around their maritime periphery. They also corrode it by not acting as a responsible stakeholder in helping to police and keep open a system that benefits them. This is something the United States has done for the better part of 100 years. And it's frankly something, if you actually really want to be a superpower, you have to be able and willing to look beyond your own narrow interests and invest more broadly in public goods that facilitate a range of global interests, but first and foremost, they facilitate yours because you're a massive trading nation and have disproportionate exposure. That is something that the party leadership in China, so far, it's a philosophy they have not been willing to adopt. I don't know if that changes or not, but the bottom line is I think what the U.S. has to accept at this point is, coming back to your example of the Red Sea and the Houthi situation, even though we'd like the Chinese to act as a responsible party, it doesn't look like they're going to. And so we just have to work and engineer around that. And at the end of the day, being able to restore and ensure free flows of commerce is something that's so overwhelmingly in our interest that even if certain other countries that should invest in it are not, we nonetheless should ourselves, because there's so much benefit both for us and for our allies and partners from our activities doing those things.
Do we observe now similar tactics by other autocracies? Does Russia stockpile oil, gas, and coal? Does Iran do the same?
They're in a different position than China because basically they're sitting on top of stockpiles of billions and billions of barrels of oil and billions of tons of coal that are in place underground. I think maybe the loose analogy is the same way that China is with coal, where if you're thinking strategically, your emphasis is more on your ability to produce than it is on what size of stockpiles you have on the surface, because you have huge amounts of the resource underneath your sovereign territory. I think that's fundamentally the situation with Iran. And it's also the situation with Russia, because actually one thing that's been interesting to watch as you've seen the Ukrainian strike campaign pick up momentum against Russian energy facilities is you ask yourself, if there were to be a truly major disruption, how much longer could Russia produce at its present levels before it actually had to start shutting in production? I think in some instances, especially on the oil side, it's faster than people would think because there's not actually a huge storage capacity. The whole system has been built on the assumption that you can consistently produce the molecules and then move and flow them to where they need to go, whether that's inside of Russia or whether it's to export points to sell on the world market. And so from what I've looked at, I don't get the impression that there's actually a huge storage buffer for produced molecules in Russia.
That is interesting point of demonstrating balance, because we know that Russia tried to attack Ukrainian gas storages located in the western part of Ukraine. And in these gas storages, it's not only Ukrainian gas which is being stored, but also gas for Europe, which Ukraine stored on their sovereign territory for selling it later to Europe during the high consumption phase. How successful were these strikes by Russia?
I think in terms of engendering concern among market participants, the strikes had some degree of impact. As far as I can tell, in terms of actual physical impact, it was not nearly as much. When you think about these big underground gas storages, those are a much more challenging target because most of what really matters is deep underground, under hundreds of meters, if not more, of rock, and is essentially unreachable. You can strike at the pumps and compressors that are used to move gas in and out of the facility, but in many cases, those are very repairable. And especially what could happen if Russia keeps striking at those is there'll be a near-term adjustment, because my guess is those are either Soviet era or perhaps Ukrainian made turbines on those facilities now. And those manufacturing plants are not accessible at this point, either because they're in Russia or because if they're in Ukraine, they've probably been destroyed or shut down by the war. But what happens after that initial relatively short adjustment period is if you start using Rolls-Royce, Siemens, General Electric, and those types of turbines, there's basically an almost endless supply because we can keep manufacturing them. And I think what the Russians would find is the returns on their initial strikes might make it attractive for the first few times. But once that replacement cycle sets up, basically they're trading scarce missiles against a large Western industrial base for producing turbines. That's a fight that they're ultimately going to lose. And I think actually your question highlights a broader point, is we know that Ukraine is thinking about adopting a more broadly distributed electricity system. And a big part of this is that it effectively offers a passive defense. You don't even have to intercept every Russian missile. If you have 100 different targets and they're each small, maybe even mobile, maybe they're protected, and maybe more targets even than that, and the Russians can only manufacture 10 or 15 cruise missiles a month, they can't hit all those targets, especially if they do have to send multiple missiles because some will be intercepted. And if they turn to their drone fleet to do that, it actually starts to move toward Ukraine's advantage, because Ukrainian air defenders have become really proficient at using cheap gun-based defenses to neutralize the kamikaze drone threat. And so I think there's some structural shifts we're seeing with the gas system, and I think that we'll see coming in the next 6 months to a year with Ukraine's power system, where even before you talk about actively intercepting stuff, projectiles incoming, it's simply going to be harder for Russia to effectively target that system in a way that they can sustain.
Indeed, but as the bottom line, we still can say that the energy market and energy resources are a highly weaponized area now, and what we're facing for the next years and decades is the rapid increase of the role of energy as a tool of war, and those who have more energy resources and better protected energy resources can also win during the conflicts. And that's why it is not only economy, it's also the question of strategic defense and strategic security of any state. It was Gabe Collins, Fellow in Energy and Environmental Regulatory Affairs at the Center for Energy Studies at the Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and he was talking now in his private capacity, not representing opinion of Baker Institute or other institutions. Thank you so much, Gabe, for this very insightful and scary interview.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel. And if you have anyone who you think needs to watch this interview, feel free to share a link to this interview so other people can also tap on Gabe's wisdom. Stay strong, stay with Ukraine.